Lauren Sandler, you are a journalist based in Brooklyn, New York. Your work is featured in publications such as Time, the New York Times, Slate, The Atlantic, and many more. You have written 2 previous books, and today we're here to talk about your latest book. This is All I Got, a new modest search for home. Lauren, thank you for being here.
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you, Ellen.
So, Lauren, this book it's a crime because it's you open it and it reads like a novel and it's hard to put down. So, unless I allow myself like an hour to read every day, and when I've been reading your book, I had to go over my allowed reading hours. So, yeah, I like to know a little bit about yourself and then how you got into the topic of homelessness. So can we start by that? Can you tell us a little bit about you?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you. That is sort of the ultimate compliment, and I really appreciate it. About me, I mean, maybe part of why I became a journalist is because I'm so much more interested in other people who I consider to be so much more interesting than me. But what can I tell you? I grew up in the Boston area. I moved to New York in 1992 for college, and except for spending some time at National Public Radio in Washington in the 90s and a year in London, also in the 90s, I have been in New York and living a freelance and writing life ever since. I live with my only child, Dahlia, who is, having one child and all of the cultural noise around why mothers are expected to be mothers more than anything else and why society does so little to support us. That was the subject of my last book, One and Only, which was about my family choice that I made with my husband, Justin, to stop at one child, which is a choice that my parents also made. I grew up as an only child. And my book before that was about the young Christian right and right-wing politics as they have sort of come up through the evangelical church in the States, which also is sort of an interesting topic, I guess, because I am a Jewish atheist. And
wow,
so
okay.
That was definitely me stepping into a different realm to get to the heart of something that I consider to be a massively growing issue in America. That was in the early aughts. And other than that, I've reported in Baghdad, I've reported in China, but my work tends to be about inequality, most often gender inequality, and about how structural factors are lived. How we think of, so many people tend to think of the world as being made up of individual successes and individual failures. Everything is about the individual, right? And I look at the world and I see a massive structure that is manufacturing our lives. And I'm very interested in how those lives are lived, how inequality is manufactured. And I think that we tend to talk about those issues in terms of policy and in terms of data. I've certainly done plenty of reporting that looks at things from a more governmental or numbers-driven perspective, but so often we miss the stories about how that structure is lived. And that is what led me to write this book, which was, I live in New York. I see homelessness all over the place. It's been a massive issue ever since I was a teenager. And the bigger the issue gets, the less we seem to talk about it. So when I moved to New York for college in 1992, there were 20,000 people sleeping in New York shelters, and it was considered a national crisis. There were, 1 or 2 articles about homelessness in the New York Times every day. And when I started writing this book 5 years ago, there were 3 times that number, 60,000 people sleeping in shelters, thousands more on the streets, and we really weren't talking about it. So I wanted to write a book that would grab people by the shoulders and force them to pay attention to something, not because those numbers were so significant, but because of how those numbers feel if you are one of those numbers. And I wanted to write a book that read like a novel. That was that was my intention, that we, you know, through the magic of literature can inhabit another person's experience, another person's feelings and frustrations. But I wanted that person to be a real person. And so I was really lucky to begin reporting at a shelter where this remarkable woman named Camilla was living for a time. And she gave me the great privilege of opening her life to me.
Before we get into the book, and just one more question about your profession. What made you go into journalism? And secondly, you are a freelance journalist, which is, I find it difficult because you have to constantly sell yourself. So why journalism, and why the type of journalism that you do?
You know, it's interesting. When I was, you know, when I was in college, I studied English because I love reading and words, and I studied political science, and I studied film. And in all of these topics, I studied them with a focus on race and gender, and some sense of sort of the failures of our state, I think is a way to put it. And I thought about, you know, am I going to work in film? I started off working in radio. I worked at, you know, National Public Radio as a producer for some time. To me, something about the ability to be having conversations with people I don't know, and then making meaning out of those conversations just on my own it's a really special thing. But I've often thought, you know, I could have worked in urban planning. I could have been an English professor. Like, I can imagine a lot of different routes I could have taken that would have filled my mind with similar meaning. But there was something about just the chemistry that happens when you are reporting someone else's story, and the ability to use that story to help people understand the world better, that has just always been like catnip to me. But yeah, it used to be really different in a different era before 2008 to do this work, to write stories for magazines and be paid, you know, a living wage to do that work. You know, when I was doing this, when I was much younger, you know, well before I had a child and a mortgage, I was making $2 a word on a big feature story that now is like if you're lucky, $100 blog post. And so I will say that industry changed radically. And so my work has changed with it. Now I really just write books, which is a very lucky place to be in. But I have to say, I miss the energy of the quick turnaround. I miss the relationship with having editors who are working on lots of different ideas with you. It was a great time to be a journalist in a different era, and now it isn't. And what we've lost, I think, is really significant.
Okay, in regards to homelessness, I see it a little bit of online advertisement. So when the internet was born, we had all these banner advertisement that we were all aware of. And within time, we became blind to those advertisements. They are right there in our faces, but somehow we have trained our eyes not to see them. And I think that's a little bit what happens when you are saying that now there is 3 times as much homeless and no one writes about it, no one sees them, no one even, you know, they just step over it and just don't even notice it they're there. Will you believe that we have become just blind to it in general, not just the press?
Alan, I love that you were using a metaphor, which is basically an explanation for the end of journalism. The reason that we're blind to homelessness. I mean, I think it's complicated. I think that there are elements of it where we accept that this is just how we live. And as our society has become less and less equal, we have accepted it more and more. And it has been a slow erosion of personal and societal ethics and empathy. And a slow acceptance of something that feels like, well, this is just how it is. And my mantra about a lot of the work that I do, but certainly something that was repeating in my head all the time when I was reporting and writing this book was, it doesn't have to be this way. it's actually really easy to make things not this way, but we would have to decide to do it. We would have to decide that instead of having policy that allows for a population of billionaires, that some of that money should go towards building affordable housing, or supportive housing, or, you know, providing rent subsidies for people who need it. But as a society, because of the way, and I realize that this is a term that will turn some people off, but the way that late capitalism has structured how we live and what we feel, what we believe is true and possible and who we should be and what feels fair in the world, that has really shifted off, the ability to actually be troubled by what we see around us. And I think that there is an element of blindness in there. I also think at the same time, people have not just been socially marginalized in poverty as a concept, they've been physically marginalized often, where, for example, in New York City, people have been bussed out of the city. So homeless people won't be an eyesore for tourists. Or, if you are poor in a city, you probably live in its farthest margins. It used to be that you would live in the inner city. The inner city is now the outer city. And because the way we live is so often segregated, right? You have rich neighborhoods, you have poor neighborhoods. It's not all that often that we are actually in contact with the full scope of what this problem is. So you may see a homeless guy on the subway, but he represents one person and not what it would mean if we were actually to put all of the homeless people on the subway. And to me, I think that we need to choose to wake up, and we need to choose to see people who are living in the crisis of poverty as people like anyone else. They are sometimes people with mental illness and need some support for that, but there are also plenty of people, not that, the people without mental illness are more deserving of our support or empathy, but there are plenty of people who are just like people who are housed and thriving, and often people who are wealthy, with the same aptitude, the same capabilities, just have been born into a very different circumstance or have found themselves, think of the millions of people through the pandemic who have now suddenly found themselves in a different circumstance that they could have never imagined they would be in.
Okay, so I'm asking this question from the point of view of an outsider. I come from Latin America, and from our point of view, we see the United States as this land of opportunities, where anyone could have a job, where everyone could have housing if they truly want to go for it. So can you, from my ignorance point of view, can you tell me, how does homelessness happen? How does one fall through the cracks to not having a place to live?
Well, it's interesting. I never thought about this before this moment, but I just heard you say, how does someone fall through the cracks? And my first time I've thought about this now is that suggests that they're over the cracks and they can fall through them.
I see.
People are not usually in that situation of stability and then they fall. They are usually in a situation where they simply cannot rise up through the crack. And, let's look, I'm going to tell you two different stories. First, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Camilla's family. So Camilla is, of course, the protagonist of this book. Her mother was born in the US, but her mother's many siblings were born in the Dominican Republic. Her whole family's from the Dominican Republic originally. And her mother, as a poor single mother, had what we call Section 8. So that's a rent check that you get if you can't, support yourself to have your rent paid, so that, you, and in this case, your children, can have stable housing, be in a stable school district, have some sense of safety and grounding, which to me is a basic human right. That program has barely even been functioning for years now. And so Camilla, who's now found herself in a similar position to her mother, doesn't have Section 8. And so instead, in the book, we see her going from, from a shelter to having been in another shelter, moving into an overcrowded apartment, not knowing if she's going to end up on the street. So that one policy is the difference between being housed and not housed. For a family that showed up in the States looking for opportunity, did have a little bit of support, and honestly, Camilla's mother could have had not one, but now I'm thinking of Camilla's sister too, two daughters who had gone on to law school. And instead, obviously, what we see happening is very, very different. And so that little bit of social support, which is part of the myth of America, is at odds with this other myth of America, which is you do it on your own. You pull yourself up by your bootstraps. That is so bogus. Anyone who's telling you that is probably living in a situation of inherited property, some degree of inherited wealth, having been raised with a certain degree of stability, certain school systems. And so who gets to have that story is something that is completely policed. Some people get it and some people don't. And it's all a question of the accident of your birth. So another story to tell you is one that I just heard 2 nights ago. December 21st every year is the annual memorial for all the homeless people who have died that year. And around that time, there's a service where in New York City, there's a collection of names. This year it was 340 that we know. Of course, there are many, many more of homeless people who have died, and all the names are read. There's a candle lit for each name, and a few of these people are eulogized. And one of the men who was eulogized came from Chiapas. He has 4 kids and a wife, and he came here to make a living, but he couldn't. So he ended up living on a loading dock of a dry cleaners and pushing his shopping cart around, trying to help anyone with their packages, with their cars, having a little broom in his cart and a little blanket. And that was his house. He would put his blanket over himself after he would sweep off the loading dock every night. And then he would go back out there in the morning. And he died on that loading dock with his 4 children and his wife at home in Mexico. And that is the reality of so many people who are coming to the United States because of the story they have heard, the promise that they have heard, which frankly, when my grandparents immigrated as Jewish Eastern European people in great crisis and came here and lived in poverty in the early 20th century, they were given a very different country. And frankly, even though they weren't white at the time, they became white. And I think that we can't have this conversation without talking about race in America, because the vast majority of people who are living in poverty and who are experiencing homelessness are Black and brown people. And that has, I think, really racialized what people are willing to support when it comes to supporting other Americans, what white people are willing to support.
Wow, I'm so speechless taking in all this information.
I'm laying a lot out there, Len. I'm sorry
yes,
okay.
Okay, so 2 questions. So you mentioned that, of course, if one of these billionaires donated 1 or 2 of his $billions, that would help. But of course, they're not going to do that. So what can the regular individual...
Take a pause, right?
Okay.
Because we say, of course, they're not going to do that. The only reason that they have those billions and billions of dollars is because our tax policy has permitted it. It used to not, now it does. Jeff Bezos couldn't have had $120+ billion even a decade ago with our tax policy, and now he does. The number that most people use pre-pandemic, I'll admit, to say, what would it cost to actually completely eradicate homelessness in the United States is $20 billion. If Jeff Bezos were to write a check for $20 billion, he would still have well over $100 billion. That $100 billion was unheard of with recent policy. And so it's, first of all, I don't think that we should have private citizens solving a public problem like this. We need to restructure our our way of caring for each other, our governance on a federal level. I don't think that, you know, Mark Zuckerberg is going to be the answer to anyone's problems.
Right.
But that said, it is crazy to me that these people, these men, you know, with the exception of Alice Walton, you know, from Walmart, they're all men, that these men aren't taking a moment to say, wow, it is this really bogus policy that gave me this good fortune. There are really clear things that I can do and still be so unimaginably rich. There is no way that I would feel any of this. And I just think that's really crazy. And I think it's crazy as a society that we aren't demanding it.
And okay, so why aren't we demanding it? Why is that not something that is an issue when we go to the voting polls?
This is, like, to me, the biggest question.
Hmm.
I think that the story of success in America is still, and this gets back to your previous question about this land of opportunity. I think that what that opportunity looks like has become so supersized. The aspirations are so totally bonkers. And not we, because I don't feel this way, but so many Americans hold on to these like mythical stories of wealth and growth and, you know, and the notion that a free market will save us, the notion that it will trickle down, the notion that we somehow can both benefit from these people and in our imaginations be these people. And I think the deep, deep shame that we're not, right? That's sort of like, what is that twerp Zuckerberg got that I don't? You know, I need to somehow double down on the possibility of being that guy one day, even if it's so divorced from reality. I think that the American psyche is a really messed up and complicated thing for a lot of people. I think it's about punishing other people because of a deep shame, because anger is easier to feel than shame. I think that it's about these mythological notions of what happiness looks like and what success looks like. And I think that there is always this feeling of, at least I'm not that guy, and a sense of just, it isn't even pride, it's something so much more cruel than that, of at least, you know, at least I'm still white, or at least I'm still housed, or at least I'm still married, or at least, you know, I still don't have to rely on food stamps. That there is this sort of notion of looking down on other people to lift yourself up in a way which is so destructive. But I also think, you know, this is sort of the biggest question in our society right now. Why aren't we caring more in a way that is actually effective? And I mean, another answer to that is because of the way campaign financing works, the way that lobbying works, the way, I mean, the whole system is just so incredibly messed up that it gets harder and harder to dismantle all the time.
Wow. From my outsider's point of view, every time I hear a politician talk about the safety net or how more people can be helped, they are automatically labeled as socialists, and then everything that they say becomes disqualified because someone put this label. You can, if you say we have to help students pay for the education, oh, he's a socialist. We have to think about housing, oh, he's a socialist. And then once you get this label, the people who don't like socialism, they just don't pay attention to you anymore. I wonder if my outsider's point of view is too simplistic.
No, it's right on. And you know, and it's all a question of branding, right? So what a lot of people right now are calling socialism is something that seemed like moderate republicanism 40 years ago. You know, the elements of what we just considered the building blocks of a decent society are things that are beyond what a lot of people who are now branded socialists are considering. And so, and I also think, you know, I think that the word socialism, the very roots of it are something that are very powerful and beautiful and meaningful, that we would care about each other as a society, that we would not be owned by other people in the same way. And I think it's really sad. Um, I also think that, unfortunately, what is really simplistic is that we have really complex, nuanced conversations that boil down to these knee-jerk words that allow people to not think about things or dismiss things and not to engage with anything. And that also never allows us to see the human beings who are affected by what we're talking about.
Wow. Well, I live in Canada.
I'm sorry, I was just going to say, and that is really why I wrote this book, is I feel like once you have inhabited the experience of someone who has lived through the other side of the system, it's really hard to not care about them in the same way. Right. Even if that person is someone who hasn't always made the best choices, you know, whose margin of error is so different. I think that it is really harder to just, to think that we're on the right track. I mean, I've known a number of people who are people who would really point the finger and say the word socialist to other people. And then they have read this book and said, I get it now. I'm rethinking all of this. And I think that that is the first thing that we need to do, is start to really see other people so we can care for other people.
Right. Talking about government policy and comparing the US to other countries, I live in Canada, and to get sick here is not a big deal. I just go to a hospital and I don't even have to have a job. As I understand it, if you are not covered by your employer in the United States, you are out of luck. And here I could be out of...
You have to pay a fortune for your own health insurance. Yeah, I mean, you still have to pay a fortune usually, even if you are covered by your employer. It's disgusting.
And the education here is not free, but compared to the US, it's free. It's free. So I just don't see how that is such an issue that, and there are billionaires here in Canada as well. So it's not like providing service for a community prevents people from becoming billionaires. There still are billionaires here, and people have healthcare service and education. And I feel like we are a happier community here. So
there's no doubt about it. I have a really dear friend who is in Toronto. She's Canadian, and most of her friends though were in New York. She's a filmmaker. She's lived in New York for years, and, you know, went back there, had a baby, and now, you know, she's missing her friends in New York. She can do what she's doing from anywhere. But the notion of leaving Canada's healthcare is just absolutely impossible for her. And I get it. You know, the fact that we have not followed your lead in this situation is completely tragic, especially during a pandemic, that we are even debating whether people should have healthcare when this situation is happening and when our government has failed to contain it, is just mind-blowing.
Okay, so two last questions. One, other than being more informed when going to the voting booth and voting for politicians who will promote and help out the rest of us, what are other things that a regular individual could do to help the homeless on the streets?
That's a great question. I do want to say, you know, most homeless people are not on the streets. A lot of them are in places where you can't see them. And so I think it's really important that we correct the notion that homelessness means street homelessness. I mean, there are so many things that we can do. First of all, it's not just about voting for existing politicians. It's about encouraging people with good ideas to run for office as well and supporting them. It's about encouraging other people to read books like mine and feel these stories so that their hearts can be moved to care. You're right, it's about voting. It is about, you know, donating to not-for-profits who are doing a lot of work, which they are so overstretched to do, in supporting people, not just with housing, but legal aid, with psychological care, with, you know, helping them find a job. All of these things are so connected, and they're always, you know, so often done by organizations that are not necessarily governmental and which are so short-staffed and so totally out of luck when it comes to fundraising and have just mountains of endless work that they need to do. And I'm so grateful to them all for doing it. We need to help them. And then there's also thinking not just about homelessness at that sort of individual level, but thinking about what it means that we have developers that are, developing luxury condos when we could have affordable housing, or thinking about what it means to say, yes, I really support the idea of a homeless shelter, but not in my neighborhood. Really correcting our own notions of what we think is acceptable to live nearby, and correcting our own fear and classism around who we consider to be worthy of being in our neighborhood, who we consider to be worthy of being in our schools. There's a lot of this personal work that we need to do to reform society on an individual level, both in terms of hearts and minds, in terms of our own wallets, and in terms of how we think about building policy in the future.
I'm going to have to listen to this interview a few more times to digest everything that you have shared with us. But the last question is, can you please tell us one more time the title of your book, and where can people follow you and the work that you do?
Oh, thank you. Thank you. My book is called This Is All I Got, A New Mother's Search for Home. It's been out since April. It came out, sort of the bleakest early apex of the pandemic, and it will be out in paperback in May. You can buy it pretty much anywhere. If you are shopping online, you're going to predict probably that I will say this. Don't buy it from Amazon. Buy it from bookshop.org, or buy it from your local indie bookstore. We need independent bookstores to live through this time and beyond. And, you can probably find it at your local library, but I would appreciate your support if you wanted to purchase it or give it to a friend as a Christmas gift that can maybe think towards a more optimistic future. And online, so I got to tell you, I'm a little social media avoidant. You can find me on Twitter at Lauren O. Sandler, though I don't do a lot there. But you can certainly find me also online at my website at laurenosandler.com. Drop me a line, tell me what you think about the book. I really want to hear. I have a silly Instagram handle, which is sugarpuss74. I chose it when I thought I would never use it. It's named after Barbara Stanwyck's character in the Gary Cooper movie Ball of Fire. And I think I'm just Lauren Sandler on Facebook, but that's me admitting that I haven't checked it in a while.
Perfect. Okay, so all those links will be in the show notes. And thank you so much for your time.
Great conversation, Lynn. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.